Um, well, good morning, everyone. My name's Sarah Blowers, and it's really exciting to see how many participants have joined us this morning for this, which is our first conversation hosted by Battersea Arts Centre through the Co-Creating Change Network. And we weren't sure how this was going to go down online. It's the first time we've done something like this, and I can currently see that we've got 57 people that have joined us. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. Myself and Zain and a few others admitted that we were feeling a bit nervous, and I think it's because of the sort of online tech thing. So I'd like to say, in a classic BAC tradition, this is a scratch. This is the first time that we've done something like this, and just thanks so much for joining us. I just wanted to give a little bit of background as to why we're here today. So my name's Sarah, and I work at Battersea Arts Centre, and I have the great pleasure and privilege of working with Lydia and Marina and helping run the Co-Creating Change Network, which is a national network currently run by Battersea Arts Centre, working with over 100 brilliant national partners, all who are committed to the idea of co-creation. And we seem to spend quite a lot of time talking about what we mean by that. And I think in its simplest form, I would say we mean that it's doing with rather than doing to. And if you want to find out any more, please go to our website, where there's loads of brilliant resources talking about who's doing co-creation and what we think it means and how it works. And I think the thing that excites me most about co-creation is the impact that it can have, particularly around social change. And in the world that we're in now, particularly with COVID, etc., it feels like it's never been more important. With the Co-Creating Change Network, there's lots of things that we do, which I'm not going to talk about now, but if you want to go on the website, have a look. One of the things that we've wanted to do this year is host some conversations between people that we invite people to come and listen to. And one of the conversations that was always in the plan was a conversation between critics and writers about how they wrote about co-creation and participation. And Lyn Gardner and myself met at the start of the year, and we were like, is it an interesting thing to talk about? And we weren't quite sure. And then it feels like it's a really important, interesting thing to talk about in the light of what's currently happening. So we've spent some time this year bringing together a panel of 4 amazing writers. Thank you so much for being here, who all write about co-creation and participation. And my role today is going to be to chair that conversation and just to share their thoughts about why they write about it, who they hope might read it, and I guess what impact it might have. And so I've got a series of questions that I'm going to pose to them, and there will be some time for question and answer at the end. But I'm now going to hand over to Marina, who is going to just do a little bit of housekeeping. So over to you, Marina.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Marina. I work at BAC with Sarah and Lydia on different projects, including the Co-Creating Change Network. I identify as a white female in my 20s. And if later on you will talk, I would invite you to describe yourself. I have long brown hair and I'm wearing a red jumper. We will soon start with the fun part of the session, but just a bit of housekeeping, because this is the first time we host a digital event. So apologies if it's not going to be perfect. Let us have feedback. This is a relaxed event, so feel free to move, make noise, and leave the session anytime. No one will get offended if you do. Closed captions are available. You just need to click on the double CC icon at the bottom of the screen, and you can choose the option that works best for you. There is also the full transcript available. And our captioner for today is Wendy Osmond. Thank you, Wendy, for being with us. As Sarah said, there will be roughly 30 minutes at the end of the session for our Q&A. So the way this is going to work is, if you have a question you want to submit, you can click on the Q&A bar at the bottom of the screen, and you can choose to write your question anonymously or with your name attached to it. That question is only visible to the panel and to the host, so to me and Lydia. If the panel picks up the question, we will click on it and it will become visible to all the other participants. But if you submitted it in an anonymous form, it will stay anonymous. I hope this makes sense. It's the first time we do it, and I hope it's going to work. If at any point you want to add anything to the conversation that is going on in the Q&A, please click on the option, raise your hand, and we will enable your microphone. Bear with us if we cannot answer all the questions or enable all microphones, because of course there are 72 participants in the session in this moment, so it might take a while. I think this is it. If during the session you have any tech questions, you can write privately in the chat to Lydia, and we will try to help you. I think this is it. Back to Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Marina. I forgot to introduce myself visually. So I'm Sarah. I turned 50 a few weeks ago. I'm wearing glasses. I'm female. I'm white. I've got long red hair and it's tied up. I'd like to, Lydia, would you like to introduce yourself quickly, and then I'll introduce the panel and then we'll get going.
Hey guys, I'm Lydia. I work with Marina and Sarah on Co-Creating Change. I'm wearing gold earrings. I've got my hair up. I'm wearing a white jumper and a gold necklace.
Thanks, Lydia. Okay, so I'm now going to introduce the panel. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited about this conversation. So if you'd just like to each introduce yourself, and then I'm going to kick off with the first question. So Zain, I wonder if you'd like to go first.
Hi, my name is Zain. I'm South Asian and male. I'm wearing a grey jumper, and I'm a program manager for a charity called Maslaha.
Thanks, Zain. I'm just going to go around on my screen. So David, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello, my name's David, and I also have my hair up in the sense that I don't have any. I have a hat instead though, and a pair of glasses and a green check shirt. And I am a parent of 2 children. I used to work at Battersea Arts Centre.
Thanks, David. Lyn, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Lyn. I'm white. My pronouns are she, her. I'm wearing a bright pink jumper and I'm wearing glasses and I have straight blondish hair, and I've been writing and thinking aloud about theatre, well, probably it sometimes feels as if since it was invented, but certainly for the last 40 years.
Thanks very much, Lyn. Maddy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Maddy. I have shortish brown, quite messy hair. It's really disconcerting having to look at my face all the time. I might have to switch off self-view. And I'm wearing glasses and a blue cardigan, and I'm sitting with a radiator behind me which is off, so I might well be putting another cardigan on at some point in the next hour.
Oh, thanks so much, everyone. It was really great to hear everyone's descriptions of themselves. So I'm going to pose the first question, and yeah, please feel free to dive in. So my first question is, can writers and critics review this work? And what do we mean by review? Is that even possible? And when I say this work, I mean the idea of co-created pieces of work or participation. I'll just say that again. Can writers and critics review this work? And if so, what do we mean by review? Feel free to dive in, anyone.
I mean, I could dive in if that's helpful. Of course they can. And I, in many ways, I would say, why wouldn't they want to do so? Because it seems to me that the last few years have proved, and I think the next few years will prove even more, that it is some of the most interesting work that is being created. I guess there are questions, though, it would seem to me, around the way that you've posed that posed the question itself, and that's to do with the fact, can they, should they want to? And the answer is yes, but sometimes I think that it's difficult, and I think it depends very much on who it is that you're writing for, because often editors and particularly commissioning editors do not actually see this work as being sort of worthy of review. and certainly, you know, not when it's up against Frozen in the West End. And so I would say that my experience as a writer is that you often have to be a bit sneaky about the way that you try and write about it. And that might mean not necessarily doing it within the review format itself. And in some ways, I think that that can have enormous advantages, because I think there is something extremely odd about writing about work which is often not just about product, but which is also about process, and that you end up having to write about it, certainly within the mainstream, where you in the end put a star rating on it as though it's a fridge that people might be going out to buy. So that's what I would say to begin. Thanks, Lyn. Would anyone like to add to that, or add any more thoughts?
I would really like to. My dog is kicking off. So, David, you were leaning forward. Why don't you go? And then she might shut up.
Well, actually, I wanted to start by thanking Maddy, because she just made me realize that there's something called self-view on Zoom, and I've been able to switch it off. I didn't know you could do that. So I'm now not looking at myself. So I feel completely, probably overconfident on Zoom for the first time ever. So thank you, Maddy. Yeah, I agree with what Lyn said. I suppose one thing to consider is that, I mean, I don't really feel like a writer. I think I tend to write stuff when I'm trying to work something out, or when I'm angry about something, and in a way my process is to just write endless drafts of something in order to help me work this out, in order to help me work something out. So I guess I preface this conversation by saying I feel a little bit of a fraud answering that question, because I'm not really a writer that's paid to write. Well, not really, I'm not. So I suppose one of the things that maybe I would question is whether, when you ask that question, do we want to write about this work in the way that critics currently write about work? Exactly. I mean, this echoes what Lyn was saying about the kind of, you know, the fridge stars, but equally the kind of the limitation on the number of words often within publications, the whole kind of commissioning process, who it is who gets to write about that work. And I suppose one of the things, just to throw something in there about, I suppose, a way of writing about this work, which I hadn't really thought about until being invited to this conversation. And I was sort of kicking myself that we never did this when I was at Battersea, but why, if you take a project like The Agency, for example, so it's a project that works with young people in a particular territory, often on housing estates, to develop their own idea, their own social enterprise, and to develop that through sort of iterations and in partnership with the community which they're working with. If one wanted to write about that, I don't know why we didn't, as a project producer, if you like, put in the budget money for both what you might term a kind of, I guess, professional writer or a journalist, a documenter, somebody who does that for their job, but equally put money in for people within the territory, within the community, within the project, within this kind of the group of people that's making, for writers to come forward, or people who are interested in writing to come forward within that project. And potentially there's a partnership there. I mean, it would be something that would obviously be brokered, and it would be completely individual and bespoke to the situation. But I suppose, so I suppose, sorry, rambling, but my two thoughts to add to what Lyn said, which I totally agree with, is one is, do we want to write about the work in the way that work is currently written about, or do we want to find a different way of writing about work? And secondly, who's writing about the work, and are there ways that projects could actually make sure that within the way they construct their budgets and construct their teams, that actually they think about writers from within the community, within the setting, within the territory, and to find find those voices and support those voices to write about the work.
Thanks, David. That was great. Before I move on to the next question, Zain or Maddy, I wondered if you wanted to add any thoughts on that.
I would add to David's point about who is in the position to write, or who is doing the writing or reviewing. I think the idea that he proposed of sort of someone within that geography or within that locality, or someone's familiar with that territory being sort of mentored or given the development to be able to write and review critically is really key and important. Because I think in some ways, reviewing or critiquing work is already happening. Not so much the critiquing. I think organizations, local authorities are already sort of reviewing their own work, and it ends up becoming quite a self-aggrandizing thing of, this project that we're doing is so brilliant, it's cutting edge. And that happens through the comms and marketing and the Twitter and the Instagram, and sort of saying, we've done this project and we had a partnership with X group, and these are the reasons why it's brilliant. I think that tends to happen. It also ties into sort of getting further funding. And I've seen, maybe I'll bring it up now or later, I've seen 2 or 3 examples of work of reviewers sort of reviewing process critically in a mainstream context and in a sort of more local context, which I've been really sort of amazed by and has given me very specific insight. And I think there's also something to say, I won't go too much into it, but also something to say about local newspaper and local newspaper infrastructure, which is sort of collapsed, which would oftentimes be the sort of conduit for these kinds of reviews and criticisms, or you know, if you're going to have a constructive critique of a process of a community arts project, it might happen through a local newspaper. Unfortunately, that's going to become more and more rare as time goes on.
Thanks, Zain. Maddy, did you want to add anything in before I move on?
I feel like so much has been covered that if I get started, I'll still be talking in about half an hour, and it might be safer to move on.
Okay.
And then maybe I'll start on the next one.
Cool. My next question is, and I don't know if there's an answer to this, but in these conversations that we've had, I think I've wondered, is it even possible to review this work in the way that you might review a traditional piece of touring work? And I think part of the feeling of that was, if you had a brilliant methodology or sort of recipe for co-creation and it was moved somewhere else, how would that be reviewed? Could there ever be a criteria, or is that not a useful thing? Do we need to think about writing about this work in a totally different way? Does that make sense, Maddy?
Yeah. So I mean, this kind of comes back to what I might have raised or pushed at from the first question as well. Like, what do we mean by review? And when I was thinking about today, I was thinking about I mean, like basically everyone who writes about theatre, like we've all been so massively like influenced and enabled by Lyn. And I think loads about something that Lyn wrote in about 2012 or 2013 about the importance of writing about processes, both to share good practice, but also so that bad practice doesn't get repeated. But that's not what a review is doing. A review is doing something else. Since that time, 2012, 2013, I've been much less interested in writing reviews and much more interested in writing about performance as a like practice of living, and I think there's something about thinking about this as storytelling rather than reviewing, and thinking about sorry, I'm in that place where like I've got so many things in my head that I can't quite gather them into anything coherent. So just to like, I guess if I just stick with my own practice, just to like give myself a bit of space for clarity, I try to think about reviewing as a creative practice rather than as a judging something and I try to think about like how to build a relationship with the work and the people who are making the work, so that the story that you're telling about it is kind of arising from the work itself as well. But I think what we're talking about when we talk about reviewing is something different. I think we're talking about something that is standing outside of it. And there's a kind of problem when we think about in terms of like how newspaper journalism works, where there's you end up kind of trying to apply the conditions of independent journalism to the writing as well, and you end up with kind of and these are important as well, kind of trying to think about how to expose the hidden, and all of these are different things, but I feel like they get kind of all muddled together under the title review. And it's like there's some untangling that needs to happen. And as you can hear from how I'm struggling with this, like, even though I've been thinking about this for like 8-9 years, it's still tangled up in my own head as well. Yeah, I'm going to leave it at that and hand on to someone else, because I feel like I'm being really incoherent. Sarah, you're on mute. Sorry.
I think it's the saying of 2020, isn't it? You're on mute. Thanks, Maddy. I'm going to jump to a question because I think it will actually start to unpick some of what you were saying. And I think it's quite a juicy question. Is what do you think the ethics are about writing about this sort of work? And I wanted to pose that question because I'm thinking about my own practice in this world and thinking about how I might write about it. And sometimes you might say, oh, a review might look like this was a really amazing piece of work because it enabled some people to come off benefits and their mental health has really improved. And is that ethical to be writing about that sort of thing? So I think in the world of co-creation and participation, the stories that maybe broadsheets want or other people is around how has it changed someone's life? And people always want that. And yeah, what are the ethics about when you write about this sort of work? Because it is actually about real people and how much we crave Love Island or reality TV, and how does that work when you're particularly talking about work which has created social impact. Does anyone want to kick off with some thoughts about that? I mean, not literally kick off, but
I was just going to reference earlier on, I mentioned like I guess when thinking about this question, this conversation beforehand, I was sort of looking into and researching people journalists and writers who've published work or written work around reviewing or sort of writing an account of co-creation. And I came across this piece actually written by a friend called, is a journalist called Dan Hancock's, and he wrote a piece in the Financial Times, which was kind of completely, I should really remember the title. It was essentially about the Borough of Culture Award in Waltham Forest. So for people who aren't familiar, Borough of Culture is like an award given from City Hall, 1.3 million given to local boroughs to sort of do cultural activity. And he was doing an analysis of this sort of rise in youth violence and sort of youth services disappearing, and the artistic and cultural money, the sort of the culture funding that was coming in. And I'd not really seen someone write about work that could create social impact whilst also couching it, sort of framing it within wider social context in a mainstream newspaper. And even then the limitations, sorry, this is really not addressing the ethical question directly, but it sort of, it does in a way, because I think what that editor might have responded to from Dan was, you know, youth violence, knife crime, hot topic, cultural funding, which funds social impact projects is also okay. That's the hook. But even then, I felt that he probably had limitations in how much he could say. It wasn't a review. He had very particular limitations. And when I contrast that with, for the people who might be familiar with them, the art critic duo, The White Pew, and I read a piece they wrote about a collaboration that the Chisenhale Gallery did with Imran Peretta and local community groups in Mile End. And again, the title completely full, but if you type in those keywords, it will come up. And they published that on their own blog, and they, in terms of ethic, and this really isn't addressing your question, I'm completely going off on a tangent, but in terms of
actually, it for a bit, Zain.
In terms of that piece itself, I think they were writing about the sort of very nitty-gritty of the processes and the process of that project, the sort of good things, the bad things, how they engage with local groups, what was produced, but in a way that was so sort of enriching and nourishing to even read. And you could acknowledge, okay, they've tried to do something here, and here are the flaws in the sort of process and what they could have done better. You know, down to like the White Cube researching specific statistics about, you know, how much they fundraised for the project. And so all of that was really useful. I think there's a sort of contrast with having to give up certain things to be published in the mainstream, which I'm less experienced in. Of course, I think there's people on the panel who can speak to that. But I think I found it interesting comparing Dan's piece, which is through no fault of his own was limited by having to have a really juicy hook, which is what editors will look for. But yeah.
Thanks, Zain. That wasn't entirely off piece, so thank you. Would anyone else like to just add a comment around, is there some sort of code of ethics around this? David, yes, please.
Yeah, I think that in relation to ethics and writing around co-creative practice and so on, surely it's about, I don't have a direct answer to the question, but surely from a process point of view, it's about the terms of engagement, and it's about the transparency of those terms of engagement. I mean, I spent 15 years at Battersea Arts Centre with lots of reviewers coming to see shows in a much more kind of conventional way. And to be honest, I never really understood the terms of engagement of that, in terms of whether you know, were you supposed to talk to the journalist before the show, or was it a bit awkward to do that, and was it better to do it afterwards, or was it better to not do it at all? If somebody had a kind of an experience of the artist or the process, that sometimes that meant that they then couldn't write the review. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is that I never really understood the terms of engagement of how theatre criticism works in a more conventional sense. And so I think it's highly unlikely that it's then likely that most people will understand, you know, the ideas of embedded journalists. And so what I suppose I'm clumsily trying to say is that for me, the way to go about the ethics surely is just about at every stage to try and open up and be more transparent about what the terms of engagement are, who is writing, why are they writing, who's being paid, who's not being paid, whose story is being told, whose story isn't being told, and just trying to, I guess, open that up for conversation so that it's, I'm particularly thinking of some of the projects where we worked with people who were coming into contact with Battersea Arts Centre or our building or cultural, you know, the kind of whole cultural critical scene for the first time. And if it took me 15 years to understand it, I suppose what I'm saying is how on earth are those people supposed to kind of get what's going on around them and why somebody's talking to them and what they're doing with the things that they're saying. So I suppose from an ethical point of view, it just seems to me that one of the things that we should just work really hard to do and strive to do is to make that as open and transparent at every stage as possible, I guess, as we try to do with methodologies. Thanks,
David. Well, there were two hands up, so thanks for being polite. But I think, Maddy, I think your hand was up first, so I'm going to go to you.
I should have said in my introduction, like I'm basically going through menopause, and I'm really noticing that it's making a total mess of every single part of me, and I'm really feeling it in my brain today. So this is going to be incoherent as well, but I think it's really interesting listening to David, because what it's reminding me is that kind of we're not just talking about ethics, we're talking about a set of power relations. And like the word artist has power, and the word journalist has power, and the word writer has power. And like to such an extent that David starts his introduction saying, I feel like a bit of a fraud because I don't really write. But actually you do write, and you do write about participation. And why has your writing about participation got any more or less kind of status than anyone else's? And those power relations are inevitably related to money, and how the writing can and can't be used for more money. And you know, one of the interesting, I didn't read that Dan Hancock's article, like I will definitely be clicking that link that got posted in the chat as soon as we finish. But the thing that is interesting about that comparison between Dan and the White Pube is it starts thinking about the readership, and like what is the relationship with power when you're thinking about the readership. Like, why do you want to be in the Guardian? What kind of power does that give you from being in the Guardian? Why don't you want to be in the White Pube's blog? And actually being in the White Pube's blog would give a whole bunch of like power to your work that being in you know, just like some kid who lives in Mitcham who happens to come to BAC and write about Beatbox Academy, like their work wouldn't carry that power. And the problem with kind of not thinking about their power is that we're also not thinking about like just what human relationships are. And actually, like if you're thinking in terms of how to just be a good human being, like someone who works with compassion and with the word integrity, meaning that you want to be considerate towards people, then like to go back to the initial thing that Sarah said, like it's not about a kind of rags to riches storytelling. It's about like opening space for more people, more human stories to be shared. And I guess another thing that I think about is like how many kids who come to Beatbox Academy, or how many kids who I was looking again at Conrad's interview with Culture Plan B this morning, like how many of those kids that Conrad was working with in Gloucester like read The Guardian or read the FT, like, or read any newspaper or read any blog, you know, like where are the spaces where they might want their story to be told, and who might they want their story to be heard by? Like if we're thinking about what the relationship is between this writing and newspapers, maybe like the ethics aren't even there right from the beginning. Oh, sorry, got a bit het up. Lyn, I hand over to you.
Maddy, I would just like to say thank you very much. From one menopausal woman to another, that was very, very coherent. And I think it gives us a great rage that we can tap into. So thank you. Lyn, over to you.
Well, I think in a way, I think that Maddy absolutely hits the nail on the head there, that it is about power, but it's also actually about the people who are creating this work, and marketing and comms departments about what it is that they value. And quite clearly what it is that is valued is indeed the article in The Guardian or in the Financial Times. The problem with that is, as I know from long and painful experience, is that broadsheet newspapers are absolutely going to go, oh, I'm interested in that if it's a piece that is co-created with prostitutes, people who have experienced suicide, you know, the list could go on and on. And therefore, I suppose what I'm really saying, and it's something that I have said frequently in the past, is that often theatres who are making work, one, actually, they don't really want this work which they are co-created. They don't personally consider it of having in the power of the organisation of being sufficiently deserving of having attention in the way that their main stage show would have, perhaps. So there's that question. And then there's secondly about the fact that they then sort of, in a sense, collude with the idea that having a piece in The Guardian would be is of more importance and more significance than it might be actually of having, in the same way that the project is co-created, that the writing could be co-created, or indeed that there is somebody who, or else, you know, and it's not mutually exclusive, or that somebody comes in and follows this project over a very, very long period of time. And certainly I am involved in a few things where effectively I would perceive that, you know, I am involved over with this project over potentially years, not just over, you know, in the way that most newspaper journalism certainly is produced, which is the journalist goes somewhere, does one quick interview, and then writes 1,000 words about it. And I don't think that I don't think there's really any ethics in that, unless potentially maybe you have a very long relationship over a long period of time with some of the people involved. Yeah.
Thanks very much, everyone. That was a really, really juicy conversation, and I think probably lots more to be had out of it. But I'd like to move on into a slightly different area of thought, which was when we started thinking about the questions for this, and Maddy and Zain, I had some great conversations with you about this, so thanks, was what is the role of arts organisations? And having worked for quite a lot of arts organisations, some who are real programmers and others who are much more about participation. Quite often a large arts organisation, a lot of their funding might come from participation or co-creation projects, but if you were to click onto that website or look at their marketing, it feels very hidden. You'd have to look quite a long way to realise that that might actually be the bedrock of certainly what's keeping that arts organisation going. And is that a problem? You know, if you click onto a large arts organisation as a member of the public, do you think that work should be much more visible in a way that a brilliant picture of an amazing show is? And do you think there needs to be a bit of a step change in how arts organisations profile and amplify that work?
Yes.
Yes, David, you jumped in.
Yes, I do. And actually, I do think this follows on very directly from what Maddy and Lyn were saying, because it goes back to this idea of power, and it goes back to the kind of responsibilities of all arts organisations in the way that they promote their work, and that there is a very long, conventional, traditional route to becoming an artistic director, and that is almost always through programme. And even there have been artistic directors who've kind of dropped in from being a journalist to being an AD, or being a journalist to working on a program side. I'm aware of less or fewer, I don't know which the right expression is, which have worked in a kind of more participatory sort of setting. Obviously there are examples, but I think less. And I think that cultural organizations, yeah, for me, it would be about your lead funder taking a lead and saying, actually, look at our strategy for the next 10 years. If you're talking about the context of England, you're looking at the Let's Create strategy, and you're saying that strategy is really about participation more than it is about anything else. Well, what does that mean in terms of the leadership of cultural organizations? How many leaders of cultural organizations come from a kind of participatory creative engagement background, and how many come from a making background? It's about trustees as well of those organizations. How many participation specialists sit within the power, the board that appoints the artistic director and that helps define and set the strategy of the organization? How many, in a way, the Arts Council or your lead funder does sort of, in a sense, set that front page of the website. I'm not blaming it on them, because we're all in this. It's my fault that, the fact that we're in this state that art is still, I'm going to go on a rant, so I'm going to stop myself, with the fact that we're in this sort of situation where art with a capital A is thrust down people's throats for a fee, rather than actually art and culture being about the creative engagement of people. And I feel that, yeah, Let's Create is a really direct call to arms for people who work in a participatory setting to go, oh, so they're actually saying what we do is probably the most important bit. And I feel like there's something for us all to respond to there, but particularly cultural organizations in terms of the way that their trustees, their lead appointments and their organizations are structured, which might then encourage marketing teams. I'm slightly terrified because there might be a marketing person from Battersea Arts Centre watching this, but I was often tussled with, there's a financial reality too to this, which is that I would often fight for participatory projects to be given much more attention, but then there is this fight between, well, this one requires this much future income, and I'd be saying, yeah, but this one has secured what somebody said a moment ago, this much past income in terms of fundraising money. So there, there should be a much greater equity between the two. But I do think it's again about power. It's about who gets to make those decisions and who gets to kind of direct the direction of those cultural organizations.
Thanks, David. I think it also ties quite strongly back into that idea of ethics, and I think there are lots of people from organisations listening, so I think it's again a really juicy conversation. But I don't know if anyone else wants to add in. I mean, particularly what is the role of arts organisations, particularly who are funded by co-creative or participation work, to be flagging that up?
Yeah, I guess just to add to what David is saying, it's interesting, even just reflecting on this panel, my first role in the arts and culture sector, or even theatre, was at Bush Theatre, working in the community department as an intern and an assistant. And my role would be to actually just review the participation projects we do. It feels like quite a full circle conversation now having this chat, but I think just to build on what David is saying, I think it's even beyond just showcasing participation work. These conversations are so interlinked with power and sort of funding and the social capital that cultural organizations have in any given area, the sort of links that a cultural organization will have, or theatres will have, with councillors, with the local mayor, with those connections and those sort of links tie into what is then prioritized and what is given sort of credence, or what is given more value. I think it's also a question around value and value systems. And obviously what we're saying is that, economically, if something is more valuable, work is seen as more high art, it's seen as sort of more, therefore the value is then represented on the website itself. It's represented in what size rooms different projects are given. All these things filtered down. And I think there's a question around what norms we have in cultural organizations and what we can learn from, frankly, because I had a conversation with a curator, Gemma Desai, who's in film programming, and we were saying, it's interesting that community centers didn't make Black Lives Matter statements. They didn't, because everything that they do is embedded in that work. It's embedded in the work of sort of supporting communities on the margins. And I think it's interesting that every cultural organization had to, was obliged to make these statements. So I think there's a lot of learning to be had. And I think the White People article, interestingly, just going back to that, was talking about how the Chisenhale should, the end of their piece or their review was basically saying they should give their entire budget to Mile End Community Project, which was an organization on the ground which can't afford to pay salaries, but has been doing work for a decade. So I think there's a lot of norms to unlearn, and there's a lot of value systems that need to be redefined. And I think that links back to then what work gets pushed out and marketed.
Thanks, Zain. Lyn or Maddy, do you want to add anything into that original question, which is like, I guess basically, are arts organisations, particularly larger arts organisations, doing enough to highlight this work, or are you happy that it's been answered?
No, I mean, I would just absolutely say definitely not. I mean, and just a little example, which is I have been writing a weekly feature for The Stage about, which is based on a show that has not gone ahead, but one of the during the lockdown. But one of the questions in that is, you know, often people will, artistic directors who I've spoken to, they will tell me at great length about what they've not been able to do. They will tell me about what their plans are for the future for their main stages. And then at the end of the conversation, they tell me about something that they have been doing with their community. And you kind of go, but why didn't you kind of tell me that right at the beginning of the conversation? And I think when we're talking about, you know, power, I think David is absolutely right about the let's create strategy, that it needs to change who it is that runs our organizations, what backgrounds they come from. And I think it's only when we start to see that shift in power that we will start to see the work that takes place within arts organizations that is co-created and working with communities is as valued as much as something that goes on the main stage.
Thanks, Lyn. That was brilliant. I am going to move on because I feel that we're at an interesting point in history where COVID has basically stopped live performance. So there isn't loads of that stuff to write about. So do we think that there is an opportunity given now? And how do we, as writers and arts organisations, make the most of that? Because maybe live performance as we know it won't go on until later on next year. So somebody needs to be writing about something. So yeah, I think the question is, have we got an opportunity in this pandemic, and how should we be taking it?
I might come in and I might end up really quickly veering off of that question, but try and, yeah, like pull me back.
Yeah.
Listening to everyone answer the last question, I started thinking about fear and how people are not honest about their fear, and the fear in theatre is that any day now the theatres will go the same way as the youth centres and the libraries and the I started thinking about kind of, it's totally within kind of near memory that BAC was nearly closed down, and had to really fight with Wandsworth Council to stay open, and I feel like what we've seen since March is a kind of, is much more fear within theatre that we need to kind of maintain some kind of normality, even though it wasn't, even though it was exploitative, basically, and it was, you know, all the things that Lyn's just described, you know, really skewed value system, and I'm not sure how we get past that fear to make those changes. And the reason I say that, and I say this, like, I will preface this by saying I adore David Jubb. Like, I think you are a brilliant human being. And a lot of that is based on going to David in 2011, 2012 to talk about kind of all of the things that I was starting to work with like, what could a creative critical practice look like, and what could an embedded critical practice look like. And David gave me a residency at BAC, like all of these things, but it did not fundamentally change how what BAC's relationships were with the press, what its relationships were with newspapers, what its relationships were with how participatory work is written about. It did not result in the agency having a writer from the beginning. It didn't result in budget being set aside for writing to be integral to BAC's work. Like, those conversations were 8 or 9 years ago. And if we're still having that conversation now, and I will say again, like, I love David and I think you are brilliant, but like, what was the fear that stopped those changes from happening? Because I think it's the same, that same fear is still operating now. And it's also like, it's such an ingrained culture. Capitalism is such an ingrained culture. All of the, like, the power things I was talking about, they're so deeply embedded. There's so much like internal unpicking that needs to happen. You know, if I think about myself at like 25, the age that the two white people are, I wasn't writing that stuff at 25. I'm still quite anxious about calling out power, actually, in a lot of situations. So when I talk about that, like, internal unpicking that needs to happen, I know it's inside of me. And I think it's inside of a lot of people as well, that basically that fear that any day now, either the money's going to stop coming in, or someone's going to tell you, we don't need you doing this work anymore, because there's a whole bunch of other people who are quite willing to continue replicating the system, and they're much less problematic to work with.
Maddy, that was a brilliant provocation, and I think it really taps deep down into that fear, and often where this sort of work sits. And I think there's a really large conversation about how we can think about change. David, I don't know if you want to make a response to what Maddy said. I have got another question that sort of goes on from what you said, Maddy, but David, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I totally agree. It didn't shift. And as I said, I think right at the beginning of this conversation, it's only having this conversation that made me think, only being invited to this conversation that made me think, oh, why didn't we have a budget within the agency to enable writers within our context in Winstanley Estate to be able to develop and shape their own voices, and linking to Zain's earlier idea about why didn't we think about local papers that are looking for kind of copy, and why didn't we sort of start to make those connections? I mean, yeah, I think fear is also, I agree. I think that is based on fear. I think it is also based on, again, I would point to the fact that I feel like a real shift in terms of the kind of core funding strategy, I think would really help, because when I think about all the sort of forces one is fighting both within oneself in relation to sort of, fear of being hounded out of a job, or hounded out of a theatre, or just criticised by your peers, or looked at as a sort of failing theatre, all of those sorts of internal fears. There's also just all the mechanisms and the industry of running an organization. And we shifted to a kind of project working model, which was a more kind of, shifting away from a kind of departmentalized model where you had a participation department and you had a programming department and a marketing department, to having projects. And I felt that did shake things up. But I think Maddy's point is absolutely bang on. It's so interesting that with all that change, with all that shift within the program, still the way that we really talked about the work and the work that got prioritized, I think shifted by about 5%.
Thanks, David. Very annoyingly, I've forgotten the other question I was going to move on to. Oh, no. Because my son tried to FaceTime me. Apologies. I don't know if anyone else wants to add into, and actually the original question. Yeah.
Just quickly, just in terms of, is this an opportunity? I was quite excited to see online. I don't know what the rights and wrongs of it are, but instinctively I really warmed to what the Gulbenkian Foundation are doing in partnership with King's, about sort of looking at practice that has happened during COVID, that has championed kind of cultural creative work within community settings. And I think that is a really valuable thing, because prizes are dodgy, aren't they, in so many ways? There's so many dodgy things about prizes, but they are a very old-fashioned way to get us to kind of like, you think, oh, I'm supposed to be looking at that. I mean, maybe they're not the right thing because they play into kind of power and status and all the things we've been talking about. But in a way, if that's the game, then sod it. Maybe that's the game we should play. And perhaps if there was writing around that work, well, whoever goes on to win those prizes, I don't know if people know about this, but it's like a kind of, I think they're giving some money to work that has, can anybody clarify exactly what it is? Lynn, sorry.
Okay, it's 3 prizes of £100,000 and 2 prizes of £25,000 being given by the Gulbenkian Foundation, and it's part of their ongoing work around the idea of the civic responsibilities of arts organisations. And it's a very brief application process, and it's open to organisations of absolutely any size, and it's a very brief kind of 600-word application process, with people needing to write about what it is that they have been doing during the last kind of 8 months. And I think it kind of comes back, and I mean, I agree, David, with what you're saying, that prizes, you know, maybe have a you know, a question mark over them, but nonetheless, and I have to say I am in a small way involved in this, is that you know, I think it comes back to the point that, you know, too often I think the way the narrative has been presented during the last 8 months around theatre and the arts is that theatres are closed, and or that you know, companies or artists have not been making work in any way, and actually theatres may have had their doors closed, but actually many of them have been doing quite extraordinary work, as indeed companies have. It's not just all about theatres. Yeah.
Thanks, Lynn. I think I'm starting to remember the question that I had, which was about maybe I know of lots of organisations and artists who are doing extraordinary work, and I feel sad that not more people don't know about that. So in my sort of wider life, people say to me, "Oh, is it awful for you right now?" And I can genuinely say I've never been busier, and it has never felt more vital. And it, I think I'd like to encourage everyone who's listening or has got any influence to say, maybe these stories, this is the time for these stories to be really shared, because if now is not the time for the arts to be putting its flag in the sand and saying this is what we can do, and we've got evidence for it and we can be writing about it, it feels it feels like we've got a lot to say. I just want to end this part of the conversation with a quick question to all of you about what is it when you write? What impact are you hoping to have by what you write? Lynn?
Well, I mean, I suppose I think that David, I think it was, used a word right near the beginning, and it is about storytelling, and I think that is the way, you know, it's not about judging, it's not about putting stars on, it is about storytelling. And I think it's in terms of writing about this work, and I think this comes back to the ethics question, I think it is about building trust, and that often takes time, and I think it is about being really, really aware that you know, that I suppose that you know, that there are times where you kind of it's not that you stop being a journalist and start being a human being, but I think it's absolutely about the fact that you make sure that the human being element is in the piece, in the work you are doing, is foregrounded.
Thanks, Lynn. Zain, did you? I don't know if you want to answer that question about, I guess, what impact, or who do you want to be reading what you write?
Yeah, sure. I guess in terms of impact, I don't know if I guess in some ways it's about interrogating the process and sort of looking at I think a lot about accountability when writing, both to myself and the obligation to myself in terms of integrity, but also holding structures and power structures accountable. I read just very briefly, I read a really interesting piece which was about a scientific term, I mean the term dark matter, a scientific term, which is like, and the writer was talking about how the term dark matter describes something which is like 83% of the universe is dark matter, and it's imperceptible, but it supports, you know, the entire universe, but it's imperceptible at the same time. And he used that metaphor and analogy to describe structure and bureaucratic norms. And I think when writing, I try and think critically about that specific, the large sort of dark matter of organizations or process or projects, which perhaps isn't looked at, or look at those sort of nitty-gritty things. I keep barking on about that white cube piece because it looked exactly at that dark matter. And often I feel like things can become tokenized, and things can be, and you can be used as well, and communities can be used in particular ways. So I'm especially if it's coming from a sort of top-down local council institutional, you know, I often think communities on the margins can be used. So I think when thinking about writing an impact, I think about that dark matter and sort of in the same, inspired by others. I don't think I've done it yet, but that's definitely my approach.
Thanks, Zain. Maddy.
That was beautiful, Zain. It also reminded me of the first meeting I went to with the Design and Cultural Workers branch of the United Voices of the World Union, where each of us had to ask the question, what is the dark matter that that keeps the arts going in this country? And the answers are brilliant. It's all like bank of mum and dad and like hundreds of hours of unpaid labor. Mm-hmm. I think I quite often have to not think about any kind of effect or any kind of anything when I'm writing, because I think I would probably just stop writing. And I always hate the question, who are you writing for? Because it's always like, me, like I can't think beyond me. I wouldn't write a word. I'd just be kind of collapsed in a puddle of self-criticism. But I guess the within that, I'm always kind of trying to convince myself that something else is possible, like other ways of doing things are possible. And that includes in how I write, like I'm just, in theory, while we've been talking, Exeunt has published me writing about the Encounter show, The Kids Were All Right, which was participatory and is now not, because they couldn't work with kids during COVID. And I started writing that in April last year and had to stop because it was boring. I was boring myself, and then re-interviewed the company and then turned it into a twine. And like, if the effect of that is to tell people that there are other ways of writing about performance and other ways of using interview material, like that is a thing that it will have done. If people click on the links out of that to Migrants Organise and Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, like that's another thing it will have done. So I think I'm always writing from that place of trying to think about like what is the world beyond capitalism that I would like to live in, and what tiny, infinitesimally small contribution can I, through writing, make to that?
That's beautiful. Thanks, Maddy. David, I wonder if you just want to add anything into that.
Yes, I think it's probably worth saying, yeah, in terms of what I write about, I've never actually, I don't think, written about a piece of work. And again, this conversation makes me realize that in all the blog pieces I've written, I don't think I've ever actually written about work. I've always written about the structures around work. And I'll come back to work in a minute, but in terms of the structures around work, I sort of feel I'm trying to change. I absolutely have a ridiculous point of view when I'm writing something, that this is going to change everything, that it's going to actually make a really big difference. And I write about, from one example at one end of the scale is when we were just developing the agency, we were thinking about this idea of co-creation and trying to define it. We're trying to work out, how much power does an arts organization have versus how much power do community groups, participants, the people you're engaging have. And, cultural organizations that pretend all the time that they're sort of fans of sort of the democratic process and cultural democracy and ideas of representation. Actually, it turns out that most of the work, when you put it against that agency scale that I sort of wrote about and devised in that piece, is that, you know, most of what we do is just a form of dictatorship. And actually, when you get to something like the agency that we thought was like, you know, so radical, handing over all the power, you know, completely, actually, it turns out that if you put it against the agency scale, it's about 50-50. So it's like, you know, just about sharing power in something that we think is so radical. But then, yeah, another flip end of the scale is writing about the Arts Council and about, I've written some pieces during the lockdown about how shifting the kind of funding priorities towards independent artists and community groups rather than to organizations, and doing some sort of analysis of how much money actually goes to, you know, the largest organizations. So yeah, I feel like those, I'm always disappointed when those pieces don't completely then change the world. You know, like about a month later, I'm like, oh, well, you know, how many people read that? And but that maybe that's just me. But I wanted to say something about writing about work, because it just goes back to Maddy's thought around the shift within Battersea. I think a lot of the work that we did within Battersea was about sort of getting people to be creative, whether that be artists or staff members or community partners or the council that we work with or whatever. You know, our purpose was to inspire people to take creative risks to shape the future. I wonder if I'd started writing about the work, if I'd actually written about, you know, the agency, not just the structure of it and the funding of it and the, you know, blah, 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 but actually the work and the relationships. And I wonder if other people across the organization had also taken up that baton and started writing. Maybe that would be a way to sort of shift the dial within cultural organizations, if actually all staff members in every team, every department, however the organization is structured, felt empowered to start writing about those. And there was a space within the website of the organization that maybe had a little chink on the front page that you could click through from, and that could kind of, you know, enter a world of writing about the work. And so that you could see that the people in the arts organization, actually a lot of them were interested in that wider work, not just the big show in the big space.
Thanks, David. I think I just want to wrap up this part of the conversation. I'd firstly like to say thank you, because it's felt really exciting, and it could have been longer, and some quite coherent themes coming through. And I think the big word for me is around power and who holds the power and the structures that we are all sitting and living within, and capitalism. And how that just shapes everything. It sort of shapes how we work, then it shapes how we work with the people that we're working with, and it shapes how we share that stuff. And I think it's okay to say that it does at times feel like there's some sort of dishonesty, because quite often all this work that we write about or practice is often the bedrock of those organisations, and that I think it does feel fair to say that it would be great to see a shift in that. And David, I always love reading your pieces of work, and I think they do make a change, and I think people listen to them, and everyone else, you know, I think it's so important that we write about them, and maybe as individuals and organisations, how do we share those better? So yeah, thank you everyone for your time. We've got just under 20 minutes left for some questions. I just want to say, if anyone needs to go to the loo or make a cup of tea, please do that. Panelists, can I just check you're all right? Nobody needs a quick comfort break. Okay, that's great. And we've still got over 70 people listening, so that's incredible. Thanks, everyone. Marina, I wondered if you wanted to ask that question that you just shared with me.
Yes, so there are some very interesting points going on in the chat. So I think if we have time, we should maybe pick up some of those conversations, and we would love to also share on Twitter and see what people think. I think someone wrote quite early today, sorry, I noted it down. What can we, like, talking about, thinking about how can we as an industry act collectively in order to change the way this work is reviewed and portrayed? Is there something, are there any actions we can take all together? And then we've got a few questions in the Q&A box, but maybe this is a good one to start with.
Marina, could you say it again? The question.
Yes. So someone was asking, was sharing this provocation, is there anything we can do as an industry together to shift the way this work is portrayed and the way we talk about it? Are there any proper actions maybe we can start to undertake? I rephrased it, but I just thought it was very interesting, and it's a hard question.
I mean, I can't speak for the word we is so difficult, isn't it? Who is the we? So I can't speak for anyone in a arts organization because I've never worked in one. Speaking for myself, like something that I do try to be really honest about is I talk a really good talk on writing about participatory work, but actually if you look at my track record, it's very, very poor. I'm like that MP who kind of, when you look at the how did they vote website and then you learn that they either abstained or voted the opposite way from you on loads of things you really care about. I'm like that person basically. So there's something about actually doing the thing that you advocate for. I write about very, very, very little kind of whether it's, we call it community or participatory or socially engaged or co-created practice. Partly I write about little of it though, because I don't always know that it's happening. And I feel like there's sometimes I feel a frustration. I try really hard not to be a kind of, don't you know who I am kind of person, but there's a little bit of me that is like, come on, like I've been writing for years, like just send me an email and tell me that you've got this thing going on and ask me if I'm interested to write about it. That's how I ended up writing about Encounter, because Jen from Encounter sent me an DM on Twitter. I mean, that said, if I'm not interested, I will just not reply and kind of, you'll all hate me, but that's fine. But yeah, there's something about like genuinely committing to the change you want to see rather than just talking about the change you want to see.
Thanks, Maddy. Does anyone else want to add to that before I move on? I'm going to ask the second question in the box, everyone. Is that all right, panelists? Yeah, unless anyone wants to go on, carry on.
A few things which I guess are echoing things that perhaps already been said, but I think if the we is the Arts Council, then it needs to be more strident in its support for Let's Create and actually say, what does that mean in terms of the leadership of cultural organizations? I think if the we is cultural organizations, then I think trustees should start appointing participation and engagement specialists into the leadership of their organizations, and also explore different leadership models which aren't just this sort of pointy structure, you know, this pyramid that capitalist industrial based arts organizations seem to so love. And I think that perhaps also in terms of kind of just the volume of work, of writing about this work, it is partly about the visibility. I mean, one of the problems of going back to this point around power and the kind of the power of the Guardian interview, or the power of, is just the visibility, isn't it? Is the ease of access and the visibility and the brand that people know. So something is probably about kind of counteracting that. And how do you hear from voices that are not currently represented within those sorts of organizations or on those, you know, lists of journalists? And how do we collect, if we as the collective, if all the group of people here are interested in promoting this, then how do we work together to actually find and promote and support those voices? So how do we have writing development programs, journalist development programs, as well as all these bloody artist development programs? You know, how do we as a sector get much better at supporting the reportage, the writing, the reviewing, the support? And I say that as somebody who didn't do much of that when I was at Battersea Arts Centre, but how could we do that? How could we do that now?
Thanks, David. And I think that moves really well into the next question. And if whoever wrote the question, if you want to add anything in as it gets answered, please do. So the question is, where are the Black writers and critics on this panel? Where are the East Asian writers and critics? Where are those who are the same age or younger than the white pube? How can change be co-created in a room like this?
I agree with that completely. I think it's partly a question for you guys to answer, because I don't want to flip it, but you invited us, so I'm sure that you were aware of representation when you put this panel together. And it would just be, if it's not too mean, it would just be really interesting to hear from you guys about the thought process you went through about inviting us into this room, and who else could have been invited into this conversation. I mean, I've only been on about 3 or 4 of these Zoom things, but they're, in terms of hierarchy, it seems to me that they are the most unhelpful reinforcement of hierarchical working you could possibly have, because they promote individuals to speak rather than actually, I don't know if other people have been on more participatory Zooms, but I ain't been on one yet, and it seems really hard to have a conversation that is also, so I suppose 2 things. One is that point around the structure of online conversations, but maybe you guys could talk a bit to the curation.
Yes, I will answer as best I can, and if anyone wants to jump in, please do. So when I came into post, one of the roles that I had was to set up this conversation. So I'm on a maternity cover, and Lyn's name was there, so I made contact with Lyn, and I think even in that first point it was a conversation about diversity. And I think that in my role, I feel like I hardly know any writers. And that's possibly a real weakness, but it was really hard to know where to look. And so I reached out to the people that I did know. And so I put my hand up and say, I don't know enough about this. I'm not, I don't read enough, if I'm really honest, but also trying to find those writers didn't feel that easy. And so it would be great to, and I think going back to what David said, I wondered whether out of this conversation might come an action. And I think for me, one of the actions is on a personal level to find out who is out there writing about this work, where does it exist, but also how can those voices be amplified? How can people get together? Is there some sort of network without creating loads more admin, which is about supporting that and finding those people? Marina and Lydia, I don't know if you want to add anything in from our angle.
I would just add that thank you for the question. It's a very good question, and we did ask the question ourselves as well, and we did expect it to come up as a provocation to the team. And yeah, I think I can just echo what Sarah said, that we do need to know more. And I think any suggestions, any ways for us to learn are very, very welcome. We definitely looked at those names that are probably often writing about the shiny and glossy theatre. Take it for, I mean, take my words in the best way possible. And it's been a provocation to these people and to our team. So can we ask to these names, how do we write about these are the things we're interested in too? But yeah, it's a very good point and something we have to get better at.
Yeah. Lyn, Maddy or Zain, I don't know if you want to add into that question.
I mean, I'm not sure that I've got anything useful to add, but I mean, I would say that, like, you know, white pube has come up a number of times, but that I don't.
Oh, you've frozen, Lyn. Maybe I'll come back to Lyn. Maddy or Zain, I don't know if you want to.
There you are.
Oh, you're back.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I suppose I would just say that like white pube has, of whom I'm a big fan, you know, have come up. But I don't think that really in theatre there are many people writing in quite the same way. younger people writing in the same way, because one of the things that happens all the time, I think, around theatre, about people who start writing about theatre, is they start writing about product, and what they start writing about is about shows, and those are shows with PRs, and they are either on the fringe, and then gradually they are at the National, and they are in the West End. And I think one of the things is that it's about, there are very few people, it seems to me, in theatre still who are really writing with a bigger picture around theatre, and who might be able to link what it is they've seen with, in fact, around the kind of structures and conditions of theatre in which it's produced. And that seems to me even more the reason. I mean, I thought there was a very good comment in the chat from Alex Chisholm, from talking about the idea, that maybe we have to give exactly the same weight that we give to the work itself, to the communications of that work and around that work. And one of the things I've often thought about, I'm quite frequently privileged enough to be invited to, go and visit a theatre and try and do a workshop and encourage their blogger. And my view on that is, as a freelancer, I need the money like anybody else, and it's great to do that. But I would always also say that actually, this can't be a one-off thing. And secondly, actually, that I don't think it's just about encouraging a few bloggers who are already self-selected and often not from particularly diverse backgrounds. It has to be part of a much wider thing of audience development, of seeing actually those who make work with you, who might experience work with you, about how they might regularly be your critical friends and peers and write about that work, and not always positively.
Thanks, Lyn. I just want to read something out within the chat. I also want to acknowledge that when I asked David to be on this panel, he wrote straight back to me to say, yes, I would be interested, but also I want to acknowledge that I'm a white middle class, you might have said middle-aged man, and if you can find anyone more interesting and diverse, please, I'd be very happy to step aside. So I just want to acknowledge, David, that you did email me that. I just want to read this out from Laura Cressley. There's a lot of frustration within the indie critic and blogger community. We've been doing this work for years and are more diverse than the writers at major publications. We're on some press lists, but venues aren't doing a good enough job at finding us and ensuring we're looked after. Great point, Lyn. Bloggers also need the money. Our labour is often expected by venues with little in return. Oh, it's getting more and more. I think what I wanted to say, Marina, I hope this is okay to say, is it would be really great for anyone who's attending this conversation to drop us an email. And I think one of the actions that I would like to consider us thinking about as a result of this conversation is to maybe, certainly at BAC, and to share it within our network, within the Co-Creating Change network, the people who are writing about this work and making that more widely available. Because I think another good point is when you're building budgets and thinking about new pieces of work, to embed right from the beginning an idea of a writer. I think there's quite a lot of things to think about, but yeah, please, anyone do please get in touch with us about that. And Zain and Maddy, I don't know if you want to add in to that question. And I'm aware that we're getting towards the end and we're going to have to wrap up.
I was just going to add that I'm going to shout out Critics of Colour, which was set up, I think, by Bridget Minamore and Sabrina Mahfouz, and also just link to just a sort of a provocation around how cultural organizations can think about how it's sort of looking at the bigger picture of it, right? It's like academies and schools not, dropping drama as an essential subject has a knock-on effect then in terms of people engaging with theatre, which then has a knock-on effect on, and those which were chosen to have that drama removed tends to be very diverse schools in different parts of the country. And I think it's about just linking how these things work into each other. Like as a cultural organization or theatre, I think it's really key to be clued into the condition of schools, the condition of the area, the social impact of what's happening. And in that sense, then you're aware of, right, okay, people, what's the sort of pipeline for people to become, for diverse critics to even emerge, because there's so many structural barriers. So it's a question of just thinking about that big picture and providing and thinking critically and practically what resource can be put towards supporting that infrastructure, and so those barriers can be overcome, so those people feel, you know, that they're supported and they're confident enough to be able to write critically. That's not to negate the fact that there are plenty of diverse critics writing amazing work, and that links to also, just very briefly, our social networks and how, you know, we tend to then say, I'm going to ask this person who knows this person, which is the natural impulse. But if our social networks are limited to an underrepresented group, then that tends to just reproduce the same sort of panels. Not to say that this is like that at all, but it happens. I mean, I can speak to myself if my social networks are a very particular group. I think it's just everyone has their blind spots, including myself, and I think it's just about being aware of those social networks, especially again with that question of power and what power you might have in an institutional space.
Thanks, Zain. Maddy, I'm quite strict on time. You've got a minute.
I would, in the least challenging way possible, like to invite the person who asked the question to post up names of anyone they would have liked to have seen. Alex Chisholm has already posted up the name Dermot Daly. I'd like to ask Sarah and Marina and Lydia to leave the Zoom open for at least 5 minutes after we finish talking, so that those names can keep coming through and we can save the chat. Because like Sarah, I don't do enough reading. I don't know enough people. And I think it's in the same way that kind of everyone knows Lyn's name and everyone knows White Pube's names, but whose names are shadowed because everyone knows those names, you know. I think that's something that needs to be always asked. And then otherwise, yeah, like echo Zain about critics of colour who are brilliant.
Thanks so much. I'm really sorry that we didn't get through all the questions, and that was a brilliant question, and I think it's going to leave us with an action that feels like a really positive action. I'd like to thank each. Oh. I got switched off. I'm back. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'd just like to thank all of you. If anyone would like to email us at Co-Creating Change, please do. And if anyone's got any actions that they'd like to follow up, I think this is a time for action. I think for me, the overwhelming thing that was coming up was about power and who holds that power. And I think there is something for arts organisations to think about how they profile this work. And I'm really up for continuing this conversation in different ways. Yeah, so I'd just like to say thanks very much. Have a lovely day, everyone. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Panelists, I don't know if you want to stay on or whether we should, if I send you a separate Zoom link, if you just want to have a quick sort of 5 minutes, how it was, or yeah, a quick debrief, that would be great. But we'll leave this open. So if you all want to click off, Marina, would you be able to send us all a Zoom? And if you'd send it to my personal account, but let's leave this open. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to all attendees and the participants. I'll leave the chat open for, yes, a bit. And I'm just posting our CCC email address. And for those we did not manage to answer to in the Q&A section, if you're happy for us to pick up those questions and maybe include them in the roundup email or on Twitter in an anonymous form, that would be great. But if you're not happy with that, just drop me an email. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you'll send that Zoom link. Is that all right, Marina? Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.